Welcome to the June Air Power Seminar. I'm Jared Pendlebury, Director of the Air Power Development Centre, and it's great to have your company as we make the jump from face-to-face delivery of our seminars here in Canberra to a hybrid, simultaneous face-to-face and live webinar delivery mechanism. The Air Power Development Centre is committed to bringing contemporary air power related topics, national and air power strategy and futurist thinking to anyone with an interest in air power, not just those who wear a uniform, but all of our friends and partners across the globe. Be sure to check in each month to catch the latest seminar. You'll be invited to complete a short survey following this seminar. Your feedback will be invaluable to us so we can improve how we deliver the Air Power Seminar series. Thank you for participating. We hope you enjoyed the seminar and look forward to hearing your feedback in due course. Now over to today's speaker.
Good morning, and it's great to be here today, and I really appreciate the invitation from APDC to give this discussion. My name's David Brewster and I'm from the National Security College at the ANU, and where I work mostly in Indian Ocean security, and in particular looking at the development of China's military presence in the Indian Ocean. So today I'm going to be talking about what I think is going to be one of the most important developments in the Indian Ocean security in coming years and decades. And I'll be focusing on China's growing strategic presence in the region and taking it from the perspective of looking at China's strategic imperatives in the region and how that's going to drive China's strategic and military presence in a lot of different ways. But I'm going to start with the conclusion, and I've got 5 key takeaways that I'd like you to think about during this discussion. Firstly, and most obviously, I think China's presence in the Indian Ocean region is going to grow significantly in coming years, principally driven by its expanding economic interests in the region. More importantly, while China's military presence will grow, its missions are likely to remain relatively limited, at least for the foreseeable future. Achieving naval or military predominance in the region would in fact be a major undertaking requiring decades of sustained expansion of military capabilities, the development of local security partnerships and local logistical facilities. So instead, at least in the short to medium term, Chinese military capabilities within the Indian Ocean region are likely to principally reflect imperatives to protect Chinese nationals and assets. Now, these capabilities will be likely to grow over time to provide options in respect of responding to a wider range of contingencies affecting Chinese interests. But it's not at all clear that China would be in a position to challenge US predominance or India's growing regional power in the foreseeable future, although that, of course, will very much depend on developments and actions of both the United States and India. So first of all, let's start talking about China's imperatives in the Indian Ocean, and then we'll get on to talking about how that may affect Chinese naval power, Chinese air power, and Chinese ground forces in the region. So my starting point is that China's strategic imperatives in the Indian Ocean will drive the size and nature of its military presence and the nature of its missions. So the starting point is that prior to 2008, China had no military presence in the Indian Ocean apart from a very small handful of ship visits. But now China is pursuing a two-ocean policy in which the PLAN is likely to be continually postured in both the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Also, as part of its westward policy, or BRI, China is building new pathways to connect China with the lands to its west, Eurasia, South Asia, the Indian Ocean, Africa, and Europe. And this all creates a whole series of new interests and threats that had never previously existed. So could we have moved to a new slide, please, and the next one, please, as well. Go to the next one, thanks. Yeah. So, as most of us know, China has strong strategic interests in the protection of its sea lines of communication across the Indian Ocean. In fact, around 80% of its energy imports come across the Indian Ocean from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, and then across the northern Indian Ocean, or from East and West Africa, travelling across the central Indian Ocean. Now, all of these sea lines of communication converge on the narrow straits through the Indonesian archipelago, whether it be Malacca, Sunda, or Lombok. Now, Beijing is keenly aware that its slots are highly vulnerable to threats from both state and non-state actors. Chinese strategists are particularly concerned that an adversary may use these vulnerabilities as a bargaining chip in a wider dispute. So, for example, any conflict between China and India in the Himalayas, India may be tempted to respond in the Indian Ocean, where it has a clear and strategic advantage. And that's very, very topical, given the news overnight that between 20 and 40 soldiers, Indians and Chinese, have been killed in clashes along the Himalayan border, and many, many other casualties. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. So this means that China needs options to respond to threats to its slots, even if it can't control the entire of the Indian Ocean. But we shouldn't be completely focused on slot protection, because there are other, in fact, more immediate drivers of China's military presence in the region. And most of these drivers are in one way associated with a growing population of Chinese nationals and investments. And in fact, these issues are likely to become increasingly important in Beijing's strategic thinking about the region. Now, this creates a long list of strategic imperatives. I've got a few of those listed on the slide here. They include the need to conduct non-combatant evacuation operation, provision of on-ground security for Chinese nationals and property, support for Chinese fishing fleet, which is undergoing a major expansion into the IO, conducting HADR operations, anti-terrorism operations, and lastly, support of political objectives, such as maintaining or extending influence and control over local governments. Now, I won't go into the details of these imperatives today, but most importantly, China, at least for these purposes, China's strategic imperatives in the region really provide very important clues about the nature and type of its future military presence. So let's go back to slot protection and protecting its very extended sea lines of communication, which extend right across the Indian Ocean. Now, the starting point is that protection of the entirety of those sea lines, whether it be through the narrow straits of Hormuz or Malacca, or the sea lines that extend right around the Indian subcontinent, would be an extraordinary undertaking. And in fact, it's really doubtful that the United States could itself protect the entirety of those sea lines against a major competitor, let alone China. In fact, China is many decades away from achieving it, even if it sought to do so. And to do so would require a huge naval build-up and multiple local allies to overcome the capabilities and geographic advantages of the United States and India. And at least in my view, this is simply beyond China's reach for many decades, unless there is a really major shift in the local strategic environment. So what are likely to be the key drivers of China's presence, at least in the short to medium term? I indicated before that they are likely to involve the protection of Chinese nationals and economic assets in one way or another. And this would involve essentially creating options to respond to quite a wide range of contingencies. Suffice it to say, they would require the development of a range of capabilities in the region, including long-range aircraft, ground forces, amphibious naval capabilities such as LHDs, and constabulary type forces, along with special forces and their supporting forces. So I'll go through some of these capabilities now. Now let's start with the Chinese Navy, which probably gets the majority of media coverage in this area. So it's clear that China's current major naval expansion will enhance its ability to project power into the Indian Ocean in the long term. And China's naval presence in the region has grown considerably in connection with anti-piracy deployments in the Western Indian Ocean over the last decade or more. And according to public reports, the PLAN now has an average of around 4 to 5 ships deployed in the Indian Ocean at any given time, including task groups. Those numbers go up and down somewhat in light of the long transit times across the Indian Ocean for new task groups to relieve existing task groups. Now, these numbers of vessels are really projected to reach 20 plus vessels on average within the next 5 or 10 years. Now, as I mentioned, they're currently focused on broadly on anti-piracy operations, despite the significant drop in incidences of piracy in the Western Indian Ocean. But their missions and, in fact, the type of vessels deployed are likely to change considerably in coming years. So, for example, we're likely to see the deployment of LHDs with their capabilities to undertake non-combatant evacuation operations, HADR operations and the like, and even perhaps OPVs or constabulary vessels to protect Chinese fishing fleet, for example. Now, the key to a major naval presence and sustained naval presence in the Indian Ocean is significant local logistical support. Now, this is not absolutely essential. So we saw during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was able to maintain a large fleet in the Indian Ocean, perhaps some 20 plus vessels, but this comes at great cost and significant disadvantages. A very large proportion of those vessels were logistical vessels involved and providing logistics afloat support, and it's unlikely that China will provide will follow a similar pattern. The big geographic fact about the Indian Ocean is that it is both very large and also highly enclosed. So extra-regional powers have to travel a very long way to get to the Indian Ocean, and there they need to have access to infrastructure in several parts of the Indian Ocean. So access to local logistical support is really the major limiting factor for any significant Chinese naval or air force presence. Now, Beijing has been acting on this over the last decade or so by developing logistical support facilities in Djibouti and possibly also Gwadar in Pakistan. And these are well positioned to support Chinese naval activities in the Arabian Sea, Gulf of Oman and Strait of Hormuz, as well as providing staging facilities for missions in the Middle East and Africa. So China opened what it termed a logistical support facility in Djibouti in 2017, ostensibly to support the PLA Navy's anti-piracy task force that had been deployed there since 2008. And according to public reports, this facility currently houses up to 2,000 personnel, including a battalion of Marines and a Marine Special Forces detachment, as well as a electronics intelligence facility. Currently, they're in the process of completing a 12,000-foot jetty capable of accommodating an aircraft carrier, and there's also potential for the construction of a second jetty. Now, Djibouti is very well placed to provide support for a diverse range of China's security needs in Africa. But, and this is a very important but, it lacks a fixed wing airfield within the base, and its close proximity to the US base in Djibouti, around 10 kilometres or so, really makes it a poor base to support high intensity conflict. It hasn't yet been used to stage peacekeeping operations, and as I mentioned, the incidences of piracy have significantly down. An important recent report by the US Naval War College describes Djibouti as a strategic strong point. China seeks to differentiate Djibouti from US overseas bases on the basis of what is claimed to be benign intentions and non-interference with the domestic affairs of the host country, and we can all take a view about how likely that is. But really, the big difference between the Chinese model in Djibouti and the standard US model for overseas bases is that the Chinese model involves the close integration of its military base into a whole broader set of Chinese commercial activities. So Djibouti itself is part of a broader Chinese commercial play in the Horn of Africa, positioning Djibouti as Ethiopia's key port, Ethiopia being landlocked, and as a key part of a broader Chinese plan to develop a major manufacturing base in Ethiopia, involving the transfer of low-cost manufacturing facilities out of China to Ethiopia. Within Djibouti itself, the base is part of an integrated port park city commercial development that combines commercial port facilities with an international free trade zone and a large commercial development. So these integrated developments provide economic support for the military developments, and in fact provide the military with a lot of greater options. So for example, the military base is built right next to a major commercial port, and that allows the Chinese Navy potential use of the commercial port if so required. Over in Pakistan, after many years of denying that China had military intentions towards the newly built port at Gwadar, it now seems to be constructing a high security compound or base within the port area that could be used for military purposes, although this has been vehemently denied by Pakistan authorities. China is also looking for support facilities elsewhere in Africa, in East Africa, and there it's got a lot of options among weak or financially distressed states. But it's not always easy, and Beijing has had a lot of just as many losses as wins. So, for example, in Tanzania, China signed a major agreement to build East Africa's largest deepwater port at Bagamoyo at the cost of US $10 billion, which would have given China control over the port for 99 years and left the Tanzanian government heavily indebted and prohibited would have prohibited Tanzania from building any other ports. And analysts feared that this port would have been available for use by the Chinese Navy as an outpost in East Africa. In 2019, the Tanzanian president called for major revisions to the deal, stating that the conditions to the project could only have been accepted by mad people. So the project was ultimately cancelled after China refused to renegotiate the terms. Now, over our side of the Indian Ocean, we've seen Chinese engagement with several countries such as Sri Lanka, Maldives and Myanmar in connection with the Belt and Road Initiative to develop new ports, and these could potentially be used for military purposes. The greatest concern is around the port of Hambantota, which is not currently used by the PLAN, and there's again vehemently denied by the Sri Lankan government that it would ever be used. I recently had the opportunity of asking the deputy head of the Chinese Navy whether he planned to use it for naval purposes. He turned to me and looked at me as if I had rocks in my head and asked why on earth would have they built it if they didn't intend to use it. So I think Chinese long-term intentions in Hambantota are pretty clear. Importantly, as I mentioned, we shouldn't see the growth of Chinese influence in the region as an unstoppable juggernaut. With many of these countries, it's a one step forward, two step back position for China, and in Maldives, Sri Lanka, Myanmar and Malaysia, we've all seen very significant popular backlashes against Chinese projects and influence. So overall, my sense is that China will act opportunistically. If it's not able to successfully achieve its goals in one country, it'll simply move to another country, and there's plenty of countries on offer. We shouldn't also assume that the Djibouti approach will always be the model for the development of a Chinese naval presence. In Syria, for example, we've seen China relying on local and Russian security forces to secure its interests. I should also add, and this is a really important and unexplored area, there's very significant potential for China to be cooperating with Russia to build facilities, shared facilities, particularly in East Africa. So let me turn to air power. Although the Chinese Navy move to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Although the Chinese Navy gets a lot of media coverage, it's only part of a broader military presence. The PLAN appears to be positioning itself as China's lead military service in the IOR, and may to some extent be the main driver of China's military strategy in the region. But other services will also play a very important role, and it's interesting to speculate about the potential for rivalry among the Chinese services here. China will require a very significant air power presence in the IOR. The vast distances across the ocean means that the Chinese Air Force and the Chinese Naval Air Force will be required for transport, logistical and maritime surveillance and even strike. Deficiencies in China's ability to project air power in the Indian Ocean are a function of a lack of access, lack of capabilities and lack of experience. And in fact, overall, the dimension of air power is probably China's biggest strategic vulnerability in the Indian Ocean. So we all know that China is severely deficient in long-range maritime surveillance aircraft and tankers. Also, it has very little experience in long-range or expeditionary operations. We saw this during the NEOs that were being conducted in Libya in 2011, where many thousands of Chinese nationals were evacuated from Libya and elsewhere. So China has then chosen to deploy commercial rather than military aircraft for these operations, and that really reflects deficiencies in its military aircraft. No doubt all of these capabilities can be developed and experience can be developed, but it will take a very long time. And we have to compare this, for example, to Australia's experience, which has been conducting expeditionary air operations since 1914. So we're about 100 years ahead of China on this front. Now, geography also makes the projection of air power into and across the Indian Ocean very difficult. China is not an Indian Ocean littoral state, and this potentially creates difficulties in conducting air operations from bases on Chinese territory. China would require overflight rights or permissions from other Indian Ocean littoral states such as India, Myanmar or Pakistan, and this may create considerable difficulties in conducting certain types of operations. So, at least in my view, China's strategic imperatives will require the establishment of a Chinese Air Force or Naval Air Force presence at several locations, or at least entering into arrangements which will guarantee access. So for this reason, we're going to be seeing increasing competition for control over airports in places such as Maldives, Sri Lanka and East Africa, meaning that competition for the current competition for naval access to naval ports will be extended to competition for access to airports. Now, we've seen this, the beginnings of this in Sri Lanka, where there's considerable competition between India and China for control over Hambantota Airport in the south of the country. Incidentally, last year Australia put a P8 through Hambantota Airport as part of IPE 2019, so we're in the game as well. Now, all of these problems, as I mentioned, these problems for China are fixable, but they'll take many years. And we should really, in thinking about this, we should really look at some of the lessons of the Cold War in terms of the problems that the Soviets had in projecting air power into the region. And in that case, the United States and its allies were able to severely constrain Soviet air power in the region through access denial. Now, all of these problems may also push China to give relatively greater focus to space-based or near space-based solutions for surveillance and even strike requirements, and also in keeping with its strategic behaviour elsewhere, Beijing may place greater reliance on commercial providers by Chinese companies for its air power needs. It's also interesting to speculate whether the Chinese Air Force will try to act in competition with the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Naval Air Force and establish separate facilities which is entirely under the control of the Chinese Air Force. Okay, let's turn to the ground force. The protection of Chinese citizens and investments on land create very different considerations, and in fact is potentially much more risky than naval or air power. And there are many ways in which land forces can get themselves into trouble or into situations which they didn't anticipate. So for this reason, Chinese preferences in terms of a ground force presence are likely to be very significantly different from its preferences in the maritime or air dimension. So in my view, in order of preference, China will firstly rely as much as possible on local forces. So for example, in Pakistan, in terms of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it has prompted Pakistan to create a 15,000 strong security force as part of the Pakistan Army, dedicated to protecting Chinese investments. It's not at all clear what level of control or involvement the PLA has in this force, but it certainly also creates, this approach also creates risks for Beijing, as these forces won't be under direct Chinese control And of course, they'll have their own political agendas in whatever they do. Secondly, China's second preference will be to rely as much as possible on private security contractors, and particularly Chinese private security contractors working in conjunction with local forces. So in Pakistan, we've seen Chinese private security contractors take responsibility for internal security in Chinese projects and security within compounds, while Pakistan PSCs under their control have responsibility for security beyond the Chinese compounds. But there's also cases where the roles of PSCs have been wide-ranging. So, for example, we've seen in Sudan where Chinese engineers, I think, were kidnapped by local insurgents. PSCs, Chinese PSCs operating in conjunction with Sudanese security forces rescued those Chinese nationals. Now, again, there's a strong element of risk, as we saw with the United States use of PSCs in Iraq and Afghanistan. Reliance on PSCs involve considerable risks. They are likely to be lesser trained, less clear lines of command, less support, and they won't always necessarily have the same agenda as the Chinese government, remembering that these PSCs will be under the direction of Chinese companies. And in fact, we could foresee circumstances where Chinese PSCs respond to events in ways that might be deeply embarrassing for Beijing. It only takes a couple of private security contractors with itchy trigger fingers to kill a lot of locals and start some very embarrassing events. Lastly, is the use of Chinese fast response forces where necessary, for example, for interventions to rescue hostages, to strike insurgent groups, and potentially also influence governments. In my view, the leading force here would be Chinese Marines under the command of the Navy, given PLAN's leading role in the region, although the People's Armed Police Snow Leopard commandos will probably also be used for some tasks. This is being really given a push along by Chinese domestic opinion, including their wolf warrior movies, which have sort of tended to create domestic expectations that Chinese special forces will intervene wherever Chinese nationals are in trouble. But in recent years, we've seen a significant expansion of the Chinese Marine Corps from maybe 10 to 20,000 to 30,000 and even up to 100,000 personnel, together with the development of an organic aviation capability. We've seen a basing of a marine company and marine special forces in Djibouti, really to act as a fast response force in Africa and the Middle East. So watch this space. All of these approaches involve considerable risks for China, and I think to a considerable extent Beijing is making it up as they go along, trying to find the best model to protect Chinese citizens and economic interests on land. Now, I can't leave this discussion without a discussion of the impact of the COVID crisis and what this might mean for the Chinese military presence. The starting point is, in my view, the crisis hasn't completely changed the strategic landscape in the Indian Ocean region, but rather it has accelerated trends in growing strategic competition in the IOR, and that's particularly between China and India. They are the two key players in the region. It's not China versus the United States, it's China versus India. And this has been brought into stark relief with events of yesterday, where clashes between India and Chinese troops on the Himalayan border, which has been occurring for several weeks now, turned decidedly deadly when, as I mentioned, between 20 and 40 fatalities, many more injuries sustained. Now, interestingly, that has not involved the use of guns. Both the Chinese and Indian authorities arm their troops with clubs and rocks, and so all of those fatalities have been basically hand-to-hand combat. That's not the end of this. As I mentioned before, India will be sorely tempted to move the dispute to the Indian Ocean region, where it has significant strategic advantages over China. In the Himalayas, it appears that China has the strategic advantage over India, and so it would be a natural move for India to move the dispute, or at least threaten China's position in the Indian Ocean. And so we could be seeing the beginnings of some forms of intimidation, or even clashes of some nature between India and Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean. And that, if that were to occur, that would probably further accelerate the development of China's naval presence and associated air power presence in the Indian Ocean. So watch this space. Back to COVID. Although the medical impact of the COVID crisis in the Indian Ocean region has been relatively lesser than some feared, they seem to be coming off better than richer states such as Europe and the United States. The economic impact of the COVID crisis will be absolutely huge, much more so than wealthier states. So we should expect that smaller and economically weak states that rely on either tourism or commodity exports for their national wealth will have major economic problems. This will include problems in repaying loans that have been taken out from China in connection with developments under the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this could go a couple of different ways, or every different way at the same time. These economic dislocations could have the potential to reduce Chinese presence and role in the Indian Ocean region if it causes a pullback of Chinese investments. So, for example, China may be less inclined to provide, or less able to provide, billions of dollars of new loans for new investments. But certainly, in addition, we'll see much lesser new infrastructure developments in the region, less ports, less airports, and the like, because they'll be less in demand, and in fact there'll be any projects that do go ahead will probably have much greater economic sustainability. Alternatively, on the other side, the crisis could be used by Beijing, and the opportunities caused by the crisis could be used by them to move more aggressively, to take control of projects that are economically in distress, such as we saw at Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago. And indeed, the economic dislocations may make it much more difficult for countries such as India, Australia, Japan, and the United States to respond to economic moves by China. So watch this space. The severe economic dislocations caused by the COVID crisis are yet to play out, but it could be either good news or bad news for China's role in the region, or both at the same time. So let me return to conclusions, which I gave at the start of this discussion, and you can just go to the final, to the conclusions. China's presence in the Indian Ocean region is almost certainly likely to grow in coming years, pulled along by its expanding economic interests. So it's a case of the flag following trade, just as we saw in terms of Britain's colonial expansion in the 19th century. But while China's military presence will almost certainly grow, its missions will remain likely limited, at least in the short to medium term. Achieving military predominance in the Indian Ocean region, including naval domination of the entire Indian Ocean, would be an extraordinary undertaking for China, and really would be a decades-long project in terms of expansion of military capabilities, and just as important, perhaps even more important, the development of local security partnerships. China has very few dependable local security partners at the moment, and obviously the United States and its allies would like to keep it that way. So instead, in the short to medium term, China's military capabilities will probably principally reflect a variety of missions involving the protection of Chinese nationals and investments, whether it be NEOs or expansion of influence operations such as through HADR, or on-ground protection of nationals and investments against local insurgencies. But these capabilities will likely evolve over time to provide options in respect of a broad range of contingencies. So I'll leave it there, and I think we've got 15 minutes or so for any questions.
Thank you, David. We do have one question from Brad Horton, who said, could you expand on India's views regarding the potential for Chinese fixed basing in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Pakistan and East Africa? Do you anticipate India taking a more proactive stand in blocking these activities?
Yeah, well, look, India, the starting point that India is that India sees South Asia and the broader Indian Ocean region as very much its patch, that it is the natural leading power in the region, and in fact it sees the presence of just about any other extra-regional power is really illegitimate, that any presence by China, even the Chinese anti-piracy task force, doesn't necessarily, Chinese strategists don't see that in terms of China protecting its own interests, but rather somehow or other being aimed at India and preempting India's ambitions to emerge as the predominant power across the entire Indian Ocean. And so any presence by China is seen in very, very harsh terms by Indian policymakers. For this reason, they have been very active over the last decade in trying to preempt China's growing presence, whether it be in Myanmar or Sri Lanka. India has moved to open its own military bases in island states such as the Seychelles and Mauritius, and would also do what it could to block the development of any Chinese facilities in East Africa. Obviously, India doesn't have any power in respect of Pakistan, which is why the most likely next Chinese facility would be in Pakistan. But were China to move in Gwadar and open up a significant military facility, you could expect India to step up its counter moves, whether it be seeking to open facilities in Oman or potentially even inside the Persian Gulf. It's not going to stand still, and I think that dynamic is going to be very significantly intensified by events we've seen over the last day or so in the Himalayas. I think that will quieten any voices in India for greater cooperation with China. It will heighten the nationalist rhetoric, the rhetoric that China is India's real and clear enemy. It will move India much closer towards the United States and Australia and other like-minded countries. And I think this could well be a major turning point in India's approach towards the region.
Thank you, David. A couple of other questions have just come through, so thanks for those questions, everybody. Phil Kinane has asked, what are the implications of Chinese movements for Australia?
Well, it's interesting. I suppose you could split it into different parts. Obviously, were China to open a significant military facility in the eastern side of the Indian Ocean, that would have very significant implications for Australia. A Chinese naval base in, say, Sri Lanka or Maldives would potentially immediately threaten Australia's key sea lines of communication through its northern approaches up through the Southeast Asia. So I think that would be seen as a very direct threat to Australia's interests. But there's a whole lot of other potential threats. So if we saw the development of Chinese naval facilities in Gwadar or even inside the Persian Gulf, then that would potentially threaten the US predominance in that area and threaten and be very much an energy security problem for Australia. And obviously, you could create a whole lot of other scenarios of a Chinese military presence across the region. Very much the key to it, or the level of concern for Australia, is going to be what the United States and India do. Really, the nightmare scenario for Australia, the absolute nightmare scenario for Australia, is if the United States Congress wakes up one day and asks themselves why are they spending $10, $20, $30 billion a year in maintaining forces in the Persian Gulf, and decide they can't afford it anymore and withdraw those forces. Now, as unlikely as that may seem to us where we are now, that's precisely what Britain did in 1968 when they very precipitously decided that they could no longer afford to maintain military forces east of Suez. They withdrew those forces within the space of around 12 months or so, and we were left with a power vacuum in the Indian Ocean. Now, luckily, we're in a position where the United States was able to more or less, within the space of a few years, fill that power vacuum. But if the United States were to significantly draw down its forces in the Persian Gulf area, we have to ask ourselves who would fill that power vacuum. And that would have major strategic implications for Australia.
A very interesting question. Is the Chinese lease of the Port of Darwin considered an opportunistic move in the IOR? Why not?
Look, I think my personal view is that the symbolism of that lease far outweighs any practical significance. It's not a military facility. If one wanted intelligence on ship movements, one could sit at the fish and chip shop and count chips just as much as anyone else. The symbolism is awful, and especially the role of certain former government ministers in facilitating that lease is awful. The economic returns for Australia are very, very limited. You know, it severely undercuts Australian advocacy in the region in terms of talking with countries, with smaller and economically weak countries, and telling them to be very careful of taking on these Chinese projects, and they point to the Port of Darwin. So I think it was in symbolic terms, it was a very significant error for Australia to allow that lease to occur. And I wouldn't be completely surprised if that position wasn't reversed in coming years and Australian interests retook control of that port. And we're already hearing some sounds about that. Obviously, that would have further significant detriment to Australia-China relations.
David, do you see any increased benefits or risks to Chinese efforts to secure the sea lines of communication to Australia that Australia is heavily dependent on? So benefits or risks?
Yeah, look, it's very easy for us security types to be focused on the downsides. We have to also be cognizant of the upsides. Look, you know, China played a positive role. The Chinese Navy played a positive role in the anti-piracy operations, along with a lot of other countries. They had real interests there, which they were protecting. Unfortunately, whether it be due to China or other countries, we didn't really properly take the opportunity to fully integrate them, to try and integrate them into the operations of other navies in the area. Perhaps that wouldn't have ever been possible. I don't know. But you know, the bottom line is that China has real and legitimate interests in the protection of its slocks across the Indian Ocean, and we shouldn't jump to the assumption that everything they do is somehow directed against us or other like-minded countries. And I think it's in Australia's interests to avoid, and this is what Australia's position was during the Cold War, that we wanted as much as possible to avoid an arms race in the Indian Ocean and to avoid the over-militarization of the Indian Ocean, that our position was to keep the level of security forces in the Indian Ocean at a lower level as possible, consistent with providing security, and to avoid triggering an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. I don't know whether such an approach is possible. Now, certainly, there are voices, particularly within India, about having control over the slocks and being able to implicitly threaten China's slocks across the Indian Ocean. That may sound useful from their position from some aspects, but you could also easily see it triggering a serious arms race, which could be to Australia's detriment.
David, Jacob has asked, what flashpoints do you think might cause the PLAN to redirect significant Indian Ocean forces to the Pacific? So he's suggested Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, in the South China Sea, etc.
Yeah. Look, I suppose despite the significant expansion of the PLAN and its adoption of a two-ocean policy, its very, very clear focus is the Pacific, and it's going to remain the Pacific, and there's no reason to think it's not going to remain the Pacific forever. So obviously it will posture the great majority of its forces in the Pacific. It's very well aware that any forces that it deploys to the Indian Ocean will be much more vulnerable, whether it be because of lack of local logistical support or limited local logistical support, or lack of air power to provide sufficient coverage for naval forces. And I think that there'll probably be a degree of hesitancy about deploying too many forces to the Indian Ocean. And in fact, obviously, if there are increased tensions in the Pacific, whether it be Taiwan or Korea or South China Sea, that will only further enhance that caution. You could see that there could be flashpoints in the Indian Ocean itself, which could cause the deployment of naval forces there. And of course, we should expect visits of Chinese aircraft carriers to the Indian Ocean in coming years as well. But I suppose my answer is that despite the two-ocean policy, there will always be, the Pacific will be clearly the PLAN's principal focus, and it may, you could even envisage circumstances where a decision was made that the PLAN was overextended in the Indian Ocean, but that's just a speculation.
So if you're happy to continue, Dave, we've got two more questions and then we might knock it off.
Absolutely.
The next one is, what are your opinions on the mixed strategy of China's commercial military influence, and some observations on how these might be countered, or any denial strategies which might work?
Yeah, look, I think that the commercial military strategy, which has been used in Djibouti and potentially also places like Gwadar and Hambantota, is a really, on its face, a really powerful strategy. The comprehensive approach that China is using to develop commercial and military relationships in target countries, I think contrasts quite significantly to the US approach. If they need a base, for example, in Djibouti, they'll negotiate a base, they'll perhaps pay a fee, but I think that leaves them fairly significantly vulnerable to political changes. And the commercial approach, the broader commercial approach used by China, will insulate them, I think, to some extent from political changes, because the relationship with host countries will be that much broader. Now, that doesn't all work all the time, and we've seen, for example, in Maldives, a year or two ago, there was a national sort of popular uprising against Chinese commercial investments, which was seen as exploitative and problematic for the country. So it's not all good news for China, but the broader approach that China uses gives them a whole bunch more options, particularly in the context of the presence of Chinese commercial companies, whether it be shipping companies or shipping logistics companies or air logistics companies, that can be relatively easy be swung into the service of the Chinese military if required. So it provides China with a whole bunch more options than if it was just purely a military focus.
Okay, and final question. Would you advocate increased defence cooperation between India and Australia?
Yes, well, that's obviously something that Australia has been advocating for considerably more than a decade. It's not always easy because the Indian system is very, very slow in the way it moves. India has its own very particular perspectives of Indian relationships in the world, which are very different from Australian perspectives, and it's sometimes very difficult to match those up. The navies have a very good working relationship, which reflects their shared culture from the Royal Navy. I think really the next step, in my view, is for enhanced air power cooperation. I think we've only seen the beginnings of cooperation between the air forces. I think Indian Air Force, which previously had been very much focused on continental air power, is expanding its view, expanding its reach across the region. And I think we should be doing everything that we can to enhance air power cooperation and potentially Army cooperation. Army cooperation will be the last thing to come together, and that reflects the very different mindsets between the Indian and Australian armies. But yes, absolutely, I think we should be doing everything we can to encourage greater defence cooperation between the two countries.
So, David, Douglas Holmshire has sort of just snuck in at the last minute, so we've got one more question, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
His question is, what tangible measures can Australia take to prepare ourselves to meet China's influence in the Indian Ocean region?
Look, we have to be out there. There's no doubt. We have to be out there. And in the last couple of years, there's been very much enhanced focus on Australia's role in the Pacific Islands. I understand that. That's good, and there's reasons for that. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore the island states in the Indian Ocean region. We need to be absolutely on top of building relationships with defence relationships with countries such as Sri Lanka and Maldives, closer to our patch in the Eastern Indian Ocean. And in fact, we will find an open door. Once we go knocking and talking about defence cooperation with those countries, they will welcome us with open arms. They see Australia in very benign terms. They see us playing a positive role as a benign friend. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities to build close defence relationships at relatively low cost. It's not going to involve donating large pieces of kit. We can leave that to, say, the Americans or the Japanese. What these countries are interested in is training, sharing of experiences, and building relationships. And I think we can do that relatively cheaply and to really great effect in terms of our influence in those countries.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time today, David, and to everybody who dialed in. Hopefully the webinar was informative and interesting. Don't forget that we will keep the Q&A panel open for another 30 minutes, and we'll attempt to get David to answer your questions in writing. And all this transcript will be available on the Air Power Development Centre website in due course. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking today.